All right, I just want to kick off this video. Sorry if the audio is a little funky. There's rain going on outside. It's Singapore, it rains. So we're going to try our best to get it out of the video, but it is what it is. But for this video, we're going to be talking about cameras. So it's probably that time in your streaming career where you're looking to upgrade your camera. You're done with the webcams. You're ready to move on to a full-fledged camera, maybe one that you'll use for other content as well. So mirrorless cameras are the new hot, affordable camera. You know, they open up a whole new world for you, like new lenses, new frame rates, new resolutions. So that's what this video is about. We're going to talk all about mirrorless cameras, what things to look for, what settings you need to know in this edition of The Studio. Okay, first things first, when you're shopping for a camera, there's two things you need to check to make sure that it's actually going to work with your whole streaming setup or, you know, your content creation plans. First thing, check if it has a clean HDMI output. Usually you can actually just search the camera model and clean HDMI feed. Basically what this means is that all the display stuff that you see on your camera, you can actually turn that off from outputting to the HDMI output of the camera. Really important to know. Most modern mirrorless cameras will have this though. If it doesn't have it, another alternative or a bonus to check for is that if it can work as a USB webcam. Pretty much all the major camera manufacturers have built a utility software to turn their cameras into USB webcams. You don't get the full resolution of the frame rate, but you know, it's a good maybe half step if you want to buy the camera, but you don't have the budget to also buy the capture card. All right, so the next thing when it comes to camera bodies is looking at the sensor size. So there's three main sensor sizes. There's full frame, APS-C, and micro four thirds. And these different sensor sizes have different crop factors. So what this means is that if you buy a lens that's 35 millimeters, but you buy it for micro four thirds, 2 times crop factor. So that means it's actually 70 millimeters. But if you buy, let's say, a 24 millimeter camera to a APS-C sensor, that's about 1.5 times crop. So, you know, about 35 millimeter. So this is important because basically the smaller the sensor size, the cheaper the camera can be for the most part. But then you've got to buy maybe more expensive lenses to get the focal range. Like if you don't have a lot of space to put your camera far away, you know, you don't want to buy a camera that has like a 70 millimeter. Like right now we're on a 35 and the camera can be a fair distance away from me for this. But if I wanted a 24 when I had less space to keep the camera closer, that's the option I want to go to. So really important thing to consider, also make sure it has an HDMI output. A lot of cameras have a micro HDMI output, which is very flimsy, can break. Better ones have a full-size HDMI output. So really important to check those two things and the sensor sizes because that's going to determine the price. Now, an important thing about price is that just because you buy a more expensive camera does not mean that it's going to be better per se. What's really going to affect the image quality out of the camera at the end of the day is going to be the lighting. Lighting is really important. So don't feel like I need to buy the most expensive camera because it's going to make me look amazing immediately. Or if I buy the cheap camera, I'm going to look awful. It really, the gaps are really small in this type of thing. And lighting is really going to be the factor to make the camera look nice. Oh, and one final thing to consider when you're buying the camera is that the power supply. So most cameras don't have, they just need batteries. So you need to buy like a dummy battery to AC adapter. You have to go third party. It can be a little bit scary sometimes, especially if you buy an expensive camera. But also a lot of modern cameras can just charge through a USB-C or USB port. So make sure to check for that and just buy the appropriate adapters and power supplies for that. Okay, next is probably the fun part and where the real money sink comes, which is the lenses. Now, if you had to make a choice between putting the budget towards the lens or the camera, always put it towards the lens because you're going to use the lens probably a lot longer than the camera and the lens is going to hold up in resale value. So always put most of your budget into the lens. Now, what do you need to know when it comes to picking the lens? Well, there's a couple things. One, you need to know if you're picking a prime lens or a zoom lens. So a prime lens has a fixed focal length. Now the benefits with the prime lens is that you're going to get a bit of a sharper image and also, you're going to get lower f-stops. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I would recommend that if you're going to have this camera in the same place all the time, get a prime lens. It's probably going to fit your budget better and you'll get a bit of a better image quality. Now, zoom lenses means they can change the focal length. So if you're going to be using this camera for more than one thing, like, you know, filming content and B-roll and other stuff, definitely get a zoom lens. Sometimes it can be a bit more expensive than the prime lens or a bit cheaper. It depends. Now, the other thing is third party versus first party. So each camera manufacturer makes their own lenses. They tend to be more expensive than a third party manufacturer. Now, the next thing you got to think about is the focal length. So the focal length is basically, in simple terms, how far you need to be away from the camera to be in frame. So, there's wide angle, which is like, about 16 millimeter to 24. This is really good if you're in a tight space or the camera's gonna be kind of close to you. It does have an effect on the image. You're gonna basically, your face will get distorted a bit if you're closer to the wide angle camera. Now, there's also, I guess, not necessarily telephoto, but just normal focal length, which is about, let's say, it tends to start at 50 millimeter, but let's say like 35 to, 60-ish. And these are kind of like, some people say this is like the way the human eye perceives things. So, these don't have as much distortion with the face. And what happens is, when you have different focal lengths, you can get more separation and bokeh in the background. Like wide angle lenses tend to not have as much bokeh, but the further away you get, the more the background kind of distorts and looks larger, more depth of field. But 50 is a pretty standard one, but you're going to need to have the camera a decent distance away. And then finally, there's telephoto. Now, telephoto is used a lot for portraits. Some say that, you get a lot of distortion and, depth of field, but also you get this really nice, pleasing look with faces. So if you have the space and, you're really interested in how your face looks and, getting that, 85 millimeters a pretty good choice to start there, like 85 millimeter and beyond. 85 millimeter to 135 millimeter, like the standard kind of portrait lenses. Now, the next thing with lenses that's really important is going to be the f-stop. So the f-stop is basically a number that tells you how much the iris is open and how much light you're letting into the sensor. It can get real technical, but we'll just keep it in simple, visible terms. So when you have a low f-stop, like they call it a fast lens, so like 1.4, 2.8. 2.8 is pretty much the standard for zoom lenses, like they don't go below that. And the prime lenses are the ones that can go lower, like 1.4 and 1.2 and crazy stuff. But basically, the lower the f-stop, the more you get the depth of field effect. Like right now, we're at an f2, so you can see some good bokeh with the lights in the back with me. And the other thing too is it means you need less light for your exposure. So some people say you can see into the dark, but basically, since it's like letting in more light because it's so much more open, I guess, but basically you need less light. So that means that maybe you don't have the biggest light source, so or you can't set up huge lights. Like I have a huge big softbox light here and it can go super bright, so if I want it to be like f4. So what does this matter? Basically, the faster lenses like 1.4, 2.0, they're more expensive. So if you don't have the budget for those, maybe you don't have the budget for like an f4, to be able to expose those properly, you're going to need a bigger light source so that you're well lit and not super dark in the shadows. So that's how those things play to each other. Most budget lenses start about like f4 or 5.6, and the more expensive ones are like 2.8 for zoom lenses or 1.4 for prime lenses. So basically, think about your budget. You might need to make compromises, but again, the most important thing is to put your money in your lenses. Don't put it towards your cameras. It's really important, but hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, if the camera is staying in one place, prime lens. If you're going to use it for a lot of different stuff, get a zoom lens and try and get the fastest lens possible with the focal ranges that make the most sense to you. So if you want to look great, get the telephoto lens and put your camera a mile away. If you don't have a lot of space, get the wide angle lens and you might look a little funky, but that's how it works. Okay, so this next part is very tricky, which is camera settings, because we can get really into the weeds here, but I'm gonna try and stick with the most important settings. So almost all cameras that are somewhat designed for video, or mirrorless cameras that can do it, have a video mode. So you wanna set it to that video mode. And then the whole thing we're doing here is exposure. So exposure is basically like, how you light, or it's called exposing the image. It's kind of weird to explain it, but basically you want your image to be well exposed. Like, you want to be lit properly. You can see yourself. You're not too blown out or too dark or anything like that, overexposed or underexposed. So how do we control all this? Well, it's controlled by things like ISO and aperture and shutter speed. So shutter speed, we'll start with that first because that's the easiest one. So your shutter speed is determined by the frame rate of your video. So it's basically 2 times that amount. So if you're going to shoot at 30 FPS, then 1/60 shutter speed, 60 FPS, 1 or 120. And most cameras only, they don't go to these exact amounts, or they don't have shutter angle, which is a whole other thing. But, it might be 1/60 and 1/125. Get as close as you can, basically. Now, the next thing is going to be aperture. So aperture, like I said, that's going to be, how much light the lens lets in. So, if you have a not so fast one like f4, then you want to set it to f4. And then the last thing is going to be gain. So the gain basically digitally boosts the light in the video. And there's things like native ISO, base ISO that are kind of beyond the scope of this video. But basically, the more gain you put into the video, the more noisy it gets. So like Micro Four Thirds cameras, they're not so good with high gain values. Full frame are usually a lot better, but they're more expensive. But pretty much, I would say set your f-stop, shutter speed's always the same, and then adjust the gain till you get the right ISO. Now, there's lots of ways to judge where your exposure is correct, and this involves picture profiles and gammas and curves. But honestly, when you're first starting out, if you want to eyeball it, that works. Don't get into picture profiles, just leave it on standard. If you want to maybe be somewhat scientific about it, make sure that you have a subject. Like, if you can't be there while you're adjusting this, have someone else sit there. And then there's usually a little meter at the bottom, right? That's like -2 to +2. You want to try and get it in the middle at 0 with the subject in the frame. And for better or worse, for most cameras, that'll be good enough with exposure. If you want to look at it and you think it should be slightly brighter, slightly darker, go ahead and tweak it there. But that's what you're aiming for. You can set things to auto. I wouldn't recommend it because usually it tries to expose a person and it does a pretty good job with that, but it could easily, like, if you walk away, it could overexpose something, make everything look really grainy. But, if you don't want to mess with all these settings, that's also a good place to try. And finally, probably another one of the most important things is white balance. So white balance basically tells you the color temperature of the scene that it's looking at, and you want to set this manually. Auto white balance can do a okay job sometimes, and honestly, it'll probably be a pretty good option if you're just sitting in one spot and the scene never changes. But if you start adding like LED lights and stuff, it can trip it out. But pretty much all cameras let you manually set the white balance, so you just need something. You can use a white piece of paper, but you just want to get the biggest white object that you can, put it up in front of where you're going to be sitting, hit the manual white balance, and that should be good enough to start. A white piece of paper can kind of shift things a bit blue a little bit sometimes, but you can actually buy a cheap $5 gray white card that'll actually help you a lot with exposure as time goes on to do your white balance with. So this has been a lot of work, right? So last thing is capturing your camera. So like I said before, some cameras have a webcam solution. So you just plug it in, run the software, and it turns the camera into a virtual camera. Now, sometimes it's a legit virtual camera. So in VCam or XSplit Broadcaster, you'll see it as a camera source. You can add it in. Some aren't so advanced, and it just pops up like a window with the camera feed in it. So then you got to screen capture it and add it into the scene. But hopefully you've bought a capture card, or you have the budget for a capture card. So you just hook up the capture card, HDMI out of the camera. Make sure you buy the right cable, like micro HDMI to full size HDMI. Plug it into the capture card. You make sure you've turned on the clean HDMI feed mode and add it to XSplit Broadcaster. And there you go. It's pretty much set. Sometimes you might need to manually set the resolution. Also, you might need to tweak resolution settings in your camera. Sometimes they don't always default to 60 FPS, 30 FPS. You have to manually set them. It can all differ, but if you've gotten the other exposure stuff right, usually capturing the camera is technically the easiest part. All right, so with all that, you should have a very just base level understanding on what to look for in a mirrorless camera, you know, how to buy one, how to set it up, how to capture it. But we've only like just slightly dropped our toe into the well of videography. There's so much more you can learn, but I want to know from you, like, have you thought about using a mirrorless camera or buying one in your stream setup? Have you like run into any issues with like mirrorless camera concepts like exposure stuff? Let me know in the comments. And also, like, if you've bought a mirrorless camera and lenses and stuff, like what kind of look do you like? Like what kind of focal length do you like? What kind of, you know, aperture, f-stop do you like? Do you like a lot of depth of field blur, or, you know, you want everything in focus? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching. Give a like and share this video if it was helpful, and subscribe for the next time we're in the studio.